In this video I want to cover an introduction to form support in Fulcro. And I want to prefix that. I said form support. There are some helper functions in Fulcro for forms. My intention is that if you want full-featured, crazy, widget building forms libraries, that's something that you need to build yourself. There are too many variables for a library like Fulcro to try to be the end-all and be-all of forms. You want to render them in different ways. You want to validate them in different ways. All of this code typically you can start with some get started quick library, but typically you run into problems extending those, etc. I just don't want to be in that game. So I do hope the contributors at some point will build some nice rapid application development form system. But for the moment, you need to know how to deal with forms and form values so that you can write your single page applications with Fulcro. So with that, let's start off with some basics. I want to show you what I've set up here. I've changed the project, the demo project that's available on GitHub. If you look through the videos, you can see links to these files. This is going to be on the forms tag, or forms 1. I'll label it, of course, in the repository when I'm done. And so we're first going to look at item CLJ. This is my database. So I've set up a simple atom-based database, again, like I did in earlier demos. I've imported the project, and I've got the dev dependency turned on so that when I start my closure environment, I can start a server just by running restart in the user namespace. That'll reload code and start the thing. Then I can go to port 3000 index HTML. The file name is required because I haven't dolled up the middleware at all. And this will render the app. So I've got this database. I've got a resolver for getting individual items. This is similar to what we saw earlier. ID is an input, and then this can output the rest of the attributes. Real simple implementation. All items resolver, where if you query for item all items with no inputs, you can get back all of the items in the database. And I sorted them by item ID just to keep the list consistent. Well, I only have one, so I guess it doesn't matter. Then I stack the resolvers in there. No real other changes to the server other than deleting the other examples that I had going from prior videos. Now notice in my database, if you're using something like Datomic or Postgres or any decent database, it's going to have a support for a fairly wide range of types. If you go and look at the Postgres data types page in the actual documentation, there's a huge array of data types. Everything from UUIDs to arrays to geometric types, and of course using Datomic you have a number of these. You have big decimal, which is a decimal type, here where you can get accurate numeric representations, etc. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in when I'm dealing with a Fulcro application is that I've got this language closure on the server side. I've got closure script on the client side. It would be nice if things just behaved the same in both places. Now, unfortunately, due to some slight language differences, closure has big decimal support. That's what this capital M at the end of this number is for arbitrary precision numbers. But JavaScript and ClojureScript, for that matter, do not have a standard representation for those. Although the transit protocol that Fulcro uses to communicate these things between the front end and back end does support these data types. In fact, it supports instance. So you can go from a Java util date on the JVM to JS date on the JavaScript and vice versa, right? Those will transfer over, which means it's possible for me when I load these into my app, so I can go back to client here and show when I start this application, that's for later, on my client did mount, I load all items, and then I'm just asking to get, target that at this component so they'll show up. And of course that's putting things in my database here. Now the interesting thing to note, of course, is that since my database is giving me the raw database types that I would get, say, if I'd queried this from Datomic directly, or even Postgres. I believe a lot of Postgres drivers, if you query a decimal field type, you'll get a big decimal Java util big decimal out of the JVM, and Fulcro actually transmits that across the YRV Cognitect Transit, which supports those types. So if you go look at the transit documentation, right, you can see what data types are kind of standard supported, and it's it's a fairly rich set, and this is extensible, so you can add your own data types. You got something you want to throw on a class/record, go for it. You can just add extensions to both the client-side networking and the server-side networking at the Cognitect transit layer, and then your types are going across. For the most part, the data types are rich enough to support most of what you'd have in forms, right? Big integers, big decimals, symbols, keywords, like, etc. Things that you would have in state in a common closure application, even ratios. So what I'm interested in when I'm building forms is, where we were in the 90s, way back in the day, right, is we had the data in the database, and then we generated the HTML on the server, and we knew, and this is something a lot of people don't always remember, but inputs, no matter what data type they are, so let me go ahead and show you what I end up with here. So if I run this, I get my query, I've got my item by ID, and notice here in state I have this thing called a tagged value, which is the way Cognitect transmits complex data types. F is the tag for big decimals, and then an actual string representation of the number, because that's the only way you can carry that around in JavaScript with any accuracy. Notice that my in-stock number is an integer, and that my title is a string. Now if I make an input here in my UI, which I've already done, what I'm going to do here is log to the console the type of the value I get back. An EVT target value is simply a JavaScript, right? It's taking the JavaScript event and it's asking for the target prop and then the value prop. So that's just the normal, you'd write this in JavaScript as EVT.target.value, right? That's the equivalent notation. So this is just a helper function in the events namespace of Fulcro that lets you, type that without seeing yellow everywhere. So I'm going to log the type of that, and then I'm going to call set value, which is just a little helper in the mutations namespace that can set a particular property on this, and then I'm going to pass it the event target value. And so if you watch closely here, even though I've called this a numeric input, if I change this number to 34, it changes to a string. I reload, I use these increment decrement kinds of things, and immediately string. And that's true of all of the input types. So let's take the set value out. Well, now let's leave the set value in there. What the heck? If I change this to a date control, I get a date string. If I change this to a time control, etc., local time, whatever, these all come back with strings. That's not ideal for what I just said. Right? I would probably like to say this is a number input because it gives them nice increment decrement little buttons on their thing if they want to do that. But this generates an inconsistency between my client and server. My database now doesn't have in the client the same data type as the server. So this is really the main thing this particular video is about. I highly recommend that when dealing with forms in Fulcro, that you make your data types in the client database match exactly the data types in your server database, so that you don't have to think about these things as you go, right? As you scale up to a larger and larger application, you build more and more forms. It's nice just to have some pre-wrapped functions that do this stuff, and pre-wrapped controls for that matter that do this stuff, so you just don't have to think about it. So for numerics, this one's pretty easy. For integers, there's already a helper function, and it even understands JavaScript events for you. So you can just go to this extreme, and now if I change this number, it's an integer. So you can see that straight in state, that's being maintained for me. If you go look at the code of this, it's really simple, right? It just calls this ensure integer function that's got a closure and closure script version that just parses the thing back into an integer. And in JavaScript, if you try to put letters in here, I'm trying to type ABC right now, and nothing happens, right? So, and if I get back to nothing, I still get 0 in my in stock field there. So that's a reasonable thing to do. So then on the numeric, this is a big decimal, so this presents a little more of a problem. And so I'm going to output that column, and you see if I output that as a string, I actually get the Cognitect representation of that. And I could go and grab the underlying value, but I don't love that either. And in fact, what I'm interested in is making this something editable, and you can already see that editing this isn't going to be particularly great. So I just recommend that what you do is make something like this. Pick all this stuff up and take it up to the top. And then this becomes this. So let me talk about the pieces that I've got here for you. And it helps if I require that. So I showed this in an earlier video you may or may not have watched. So I'm pulling in a couple things here. I'm pulling in React number format. You can look that up in Google and look at it. It's just a React control that can format numbers nicely for you, and you can see it's doing a nice job here. And then big.js is an implementation of big decimal for the JavaScript VM. So I'm pulling both those libraries in to give myself some tools for dealing with these things in an isomorphic way. Now, Clojure and ClojureScript, if you've used them for a little while, you understand that there's almost no syntax, right? There's very little in the way of syntax, and you can name functions almost anything you'd like. So, in fact, things like plus are just functions. So the next thing that I've done is I've created a math namespace that's a CLJC file, so this is the same in both. And unfortunately, in Clojure and ClojureScript, there are a few functions that just simply they don't work identically. And sometimes you need a Cognitect version, like a transit version of a function, because there just isn't one on the JavaScript side, etc. So this is the basic idea. And I've pared down this namespace from what I actually use in the real project this came from, so it wouldn't be too big and wouldn't have too much stuff in it. And then I'm excluding from Clojure plus, minus, multiply, equal, less than, etc. Up here, so it doesn't through. I guess I did leave them. Never mind. Then I'm going through and making some helper functions. So one of the things I need, and this greater than defin is part of Ghost Wheel. It's a thing that lets you write your specs for your incoming argument and return type, kind of your f spec right here in the function. Ignore that for now. It just happened to be what we were using in the project that I took this from, so I didn't go back and edit it out. I guess I don't have. Oh, I do. I do have that declared. So big decimal is declared as something that where this predicate, which I've defined in here, returns true. So big dest string takes a big decimal and can return a string. And so this has a ClojureScript and a Clojure implementation. And that's if it's not nil. Otherwise, you get back an empty string. Big decimal question mark, Clojure and ClojureScript, etc., etc. So I even have in here functions for comparison. So equal, less than or equal to. I'm using a font here called, I think, Fira code that has ligatures for these guys. So this is actually two characters, but as soon as they're jammed together, it makes them look nice. So I'm defining these as functions for use, and then I've got subtraction, etc. And again, a Clojure, right? Clojure core minus works fine for big decimals on Clojure, but in ClojureScript, I have to convert it to from the JavaScript form into the transit form, and then, or vice versa, actually. Anyway, you get the basic idea. Do the math, give it back. We've got quite a few tests around these things. And I chose div here because I like to use these with a namespace so it's not confusing. So say over here in the client, I wanted to, let's actually change that to M is what I usually go with for that. So in a Clojure REPL, all right, what did I do wrong? Oh, I'm already using that for mutations. Never mind. So I'm just going to open up a comment here. and say math slash plus 3m and run that. Oh, I'm not in a, sorry, I have to go to the math namespace for that, which is going to be less educational. Trust me to say that this works the same in Clojure and ClojureScript. You can play with this on your own. I've also got the ClojureScript REPL here. And the point here is I get back a tagged value of 6 for that. And I can use regular numbers with this. It'll mix them. It'll match them. The syntax of M is supported in ClojureScript, but if you use it out by itself, there we go. It comes back as 3. So that's where like the regular plus, if I say plus 2 and 3m in ClojureScript, I get back 5. Well, that's not what I want. I want math plus to give me back a big decimal so that I can then further say math times 1. Well, I can use whatever I want here. 1.22 might be an inaccurate number if I don't put it in a string, which I can do. Right? These things just support coercion and etc. isomorphically. So that's the basic idea, and then I have conversion functions to go to and from strings reliably. So now I'm ready to deal with the fact that an input here is going to give me a string, and I'm going to have a big decimal that I want to feed a string into that input. So I'm going to go down here, and I made a UI editable money input here, and this is a defsc that does not have a query. I forgot to start my little pointer thing. It has a init local state only. This is basically the placeholder for constructors on component classes. And so what I'm doing here is when you return a map here, this sets that in the component local state. I generally don't recommend people use component local state, but I'm going to talk more about managing form inputs more in later videos. In this particular video, I'm just using this for convenience because it's really fast to code, and this might even be the way you'd want to code it. So on double click, I'm going to set the state of editing to true. That's going to change this, the get state, this boolean will be true now, and then I can switch the display type of a React number format control between input and text mode. So over here I can double click on this, and now it's an input mode. Now what I'm interested in, this UI number format deals in strings. Like if you look at the documentation, it's got an on value change that gives you back a v thing, and the v thing has a dot value, a dot float value, a dot formatted value property. And so I'm using JavaScript interop. So let's actually look at that React number formats. If you're going to use React controls, you have to be careful that when you put in a callback, you're going to get JavaScript values. That's what you're going to get. There's no glue in the interop helper to unwrap those because there's no place to plug it in. So, well, technically there is, but it'd be a bit of a glue hassle. So you could do it. So I'm looking here. It says on value change, accept values object. I click on that. It tells me it's this. This is a JavaScript map. And so I'm looking for this string value because that's what I care about. I can turn strings into big decimals very easily. This may not be an accurate number, right? It could end up with 0.56000001 or some crazy thing like that. And then of course I've got the formatted value. That's the way the string was displayed in the control. So if I take that string value, then I can use my math library here to turn that into a big decimal and then call an onChange function that's being passed to me via props. Now notice here I'm not using computed. If you've watched other videos or read in the book, if you don't have a query and you don't have an ident, this control is not refreshable on its own. The parent will always be the thing that's refreshed when you use something like this. You will get should component update optimizations, like if the props don't change, it won't bother going in here, and like that's a React optimization. But you can use defsc to make these kind of pure components that are still, quote, stateless in terms of Fulcro's application database. So I'm saying I want to use this thing, and I should take the key function off there because that doesn't make any sense for a stateless one either. So I'm basically saying, this control can be used, but I could have just as easily said this was a def n of editable money input and then dropped the factory. In fact, I think I'll do that because there's really, oh no, I want local state. There is a reason to make that a component. I want component local state for playing with it. So there's my reasoning. So essentially the trick here is make the value that's in your database a string so that the input gets it as a string because all the inputs would like them as strings, and properly format as strings. If you're making a data input, you're going to need a function that converts your instant or whatever you're storing in apps in your application database into the string that the control wants to show. So we've essentially moved what was forms on the server where you were generating the form, you were plugging in, you were coercing it from the database, putting in a string on the input, putting it on the web page, they were submitting it, it was coming back as a post where all the crap was strings. You coerced it back from a string into that. We've moved to the front end over time, over the years, and then we had jQuery or whatever that was doing some of this wrapping for you. But a lot of the REST stuff is still this, let's shove a string across, let the server convert the string. I'm saying in Fulcro, switch your thinking around. Your thinking should be, it's in the database in this format, I want to transmit it on the wire so that it ends up in the client database as that thing, and the only place I'm going to do any coercion is in this one little UI control that I build and reuse everywhere that deals with these type of fields. Right, so I write this UI editable money input once, I put it in a components library. Now anytime I need one of these, double click on it to edit the money inputs, I can just use it. And I'm done. I'm done writing code. And all the coercion is tied up in this very nice, tight, localized piece of code. So we can see this working now. If I go over here, I've got tagged value 10, blah, 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 right? I can edit this. I can put in, whatever I need. I can go way beyond the number of digits that JavaScript can handle normally. And I can basically, I've currently got this setting the value onto the server over and over again. Now I can reload this and I get back that exact value. So that's the basic idea in this video is the first layer of forms is realize their strings, manage your database with the correct types.